I have been knitting a lot of sweaters recently, and I have some thoughts. Now that I've cast on several sweaters, I, off the top of my head, don't even know how many, and have finished one sweater, I am pretty confident in my beginner ability to knit a sweater. And it's been long enough, and I've been knitting enough sweaters, and I've at least completed enough sweater yokes that I have realized that the way that I did things when I first started knitting sweaters, oh, you gonna start barking? I realized that when I first started knitting sweaters, I did a lot of things that made my life way more difficult than they needed to be. I can't go back in time and tell myself how to knit these sweaters better. I am instead going to tell you. I don't know if any of this will apply to you. I don't know if it will be beneficial or not, but these are the things that I wish I would have known when I first started knitting sweaters. So if you are knitting your first sweater and you are looking for a little bit of advice, this may or may not be helpful to you. I hope it is, but this is mainly applicable to somebody who has my style of knitting and my needs as a beginner sweater knitter. If you are new to the channel, welcome. My name is Laramie. I'm glad you're here. But I've been knitting sweaters for about a year now, and I have been knitting in general for a little over a year. I went back and looked the other day. I have had a Ravelry account for about a year and a month. So I downloaded Ravelry on February 4th, 2024, and I think I probably cast on my first sweater in February or in March. So I very quickly went from learning how to knit, garter, and stockinette to knitting my first sweater. And of course I made a lot of mistakes. But all that to say is that this may or may not apply to you as somebody who may or may not be new to knitting sweaters. And it may or may not apply to you depending on what style of knitting you do, how comfortable you are with knitting and reading patterns and doing turns and all of this. But I hope you at least glean some sort of information out of this. Full disclaimer, I am not saying that this is the only way to do it. This is certainly just the things that I wish I knew for my own benefit, but there is a million different ways to go about learning how to knit a sweater and knitting a sweater. And the only advice I have here is speaking to the way that I went about knitting a sweater when I first started, which was top-down raglan with short row shaping. That is kind of what I'm speaking to today. I am also talking to somebody who potentially doesn't have a lot of knitting supplies, who just started knitting, and they're trying to put together a supply list in order to knit their first sweater. So I'm speaking to that person, but enough of this disclaimers. I'm glad you're here. Oh, one more disclaimer, actually. I am not telling you what to do. So you do you. You go about your journey however you want. If you want to knit an entire sweater on chopsticks, I knitted half a scarf on chopsticks, so more power to you. You were a braver soul than I. But let's just get into it. So this video is going to be broken down into 3 sections: tools, techniques, and honorable mentions. So the tools are referring to the tools that I wish I would have gotten or had, or wish that I wouldn't have spent money on at the time because I didn't necessarily need them to knit a sweater. Techniques is going to talk about the different techniques and the different ways to select a pattern that I think would have been beneficial for the first time that I ever knitted a sweater. And then finally we have honorable mentions. So tools and techniques is things that if I could go back in time and change the way that I did them, I would. I would go back and I would change history so that I did these things that I'm about to tell you rather than what I did do. Honorable mentions are more things that I think are beneficial for somebody who is knitting a new sweater or knitting a sweater for the first time, but I wouldn't go back and change the way that I did it. I think these are really useful tips, but I'm okay with how I went about it. Even if I knew it, I probably still wouldn't have followed this advice. So me not following my own advice is also me giving you permission to not follow my advice either. But these are just some things that as I'm knitting new sweaters, they're rattling around in my brain. So I want to start with the tools section. So tools. I have 3 things for the tools section. And the first is a list of basic notions that I actually need when I'm knitting a sweater. When I first started thinking about knitting a sweater and going through knitting a sweater, I thought that I needed a lot more notions than I really did. Like I thought I needed so much more supplies than I did. So what I wanted to do today was show you the supplies I take with me. Theo might bark because he's having a good day. He's chasing squirrels. So, but I wanted, what was I saying? I want to show you what I take with me when I'm knitting a sweater project on the go, because these are the things that I actually need in order to knit a sweater. So if you are starting from very few notions and you are like, okay, what is the bare minimum? What do I need to knit a sweater? I got you. This is what I need. So this is my project bag. Girlfriend Collective, when they sent out their leggings and things, they used to send them in these little bags. So I'm just using that. And inside of my project bag, I have my project. In this case, it is a sweater for a 3-year-old or soon to be 3-year-old, but I'm sizing it as like a 4 to 5-year-old. But we'll talk about this either later or in a different video. But more importantly, what's inside of this bag, besides the sweater project itself and the yarn that I'm using, is a notions bag. And I got this at Goodwill. I don't know what brand it is, but it's really nice. This change purse or change pouch, I actually keep my ruler in, or my measuring tape in, and this is just one of these like expandable measuring tapes. These are amazing. I got this one on Amazon. You can find them many places. This is really amazing because I can take it with me and it doesn't get tangled. I don't have to wrap it back up. It just pulls itself back together, and it just happens to fit perfectly in this pocket. So that's where I leave it. So that's the first thing you need. You need some kind of measuring tape with you, and that is even like a not necessarily, but sometimes I need to measure like from the center of the collar all the way down to the armpit to see if I've done enough stitches, or I just want to know the overall length. There have been many times where I was happy that I had my measuring tape on me. The next thing that I think you need with you in terms of notions is some pair of scissors, because you never know when you're going to come across a knot in your yarn. And so having some pair of scissors, in this case, these are like little snippers that I found in a bag that I got from Goodwill. If you notice, a lot of the things I get are from secondhand and thrift stores. But you need some kind of scissors just because you never know. Some people break their yarn, which you can do, especially if you're using natural fibers. But it's not my favorite way. I'd rather just cut it. So I have a pair of scissors. So that's the second thing. So you need some type of measuring tape or measuring device, and some kind of snipping device, even if that's just like, if you have an extra pair of fingernail clippers, that would work. The third thing is stitch markers. The stitch markers that come with pretty much anything you buy would work. I have some rings here, and then I have my favorite stitch markers here. It doesn't really matter. You can use yarn, so you could just I used to keep just a bundle of scrap yarn thrown in here so that I could use that as a stitch marker if I needed. But you just need something to mark your stitches just in case. So that's the third thing. So we've got our ruler, our measuring tape, scissors, stitch markers, and then the next thing is a crochet hook. You probably just need one crochet hook or a couple of crochet hooks depending on what size of yarn you tend to use. I have a couple different ones in here. I have a 2mm because I'm doing a fingering weight t-shirt project, and I have a 3.5mm, which is better for picking up stitches for like a worsted or a DK weight project. I ordered these on Amazon from like just a pack of them. And then I just grabbed the two that worked the best for the size that I need. And these are really useful for picking up dropped stitches. You are going to drop a stitch in your sweater project, and I found that crochet hooks are a really easy way to pick those back up. So I always keep those on me. I think they are a necessity. There are other ways you can do it, but as a new knitter, it can already be stressful enough when you drop a stitch on your first sweater project. The easiest way to like avoid complicating that is just to grab yourself a crochet hook. And if you're doing your first sweater project and you are just knitting with worsted or DK weight yarn, like a 3.5 or a 4mm would be perfectly fine for a crochet hook. The next thing that you will need is some sort of tapestry needle, and I have several in here just to weave in your ends. It will also help if you're putting stitches on hold, like for your sleeves. You can use this to pull that extra yarn through. And that would be another reason why it may be beneficial to keep extra yarn on you, is just so that you have yarn to thread through your sleeve stitches when you're splitting for the body. But that's it. Those are the things that I really think that you need as a new knitter to start a sweater project, besides obviously your yarn and your knitting needles, which we will get into in a second. So yarn, knitting needles, obviously those are things that you need, but I also think that you need some kind of measuring tape, and it doesn't have to be a fancy store-bought one. It could be a short ruler or even a long ruler. It doesn't really matter for your first project. That you probably do want some kind of soft measuring tape so you can take your body measurements so you know what size to knit. Then you also need scissors so you can cut your yarn, stitch markers. Here he comes back again. I have the back door open so he can run in and out. He's having a great time. And then crochet hooks, and then tapestry needles. Those are the supplies that I think that you need before you start knitting your first sweater. And chances are, if you've been knitting for at least like a little while, you have some of these things. If not, most of these things are incredibly cheap. You can get tapestry needles, like bundles of them, for super cheap. You can go buy one crochet hook and you can buy the cheapest crochet hook you can find, or you can borrow one, or if your like sister used to knit or crochet in elementary school, maybe your mom still has one. Honestly, like most of this stuff, you can use whatever scissors you have. Most scissors will cut yarn. Like these are not things you need to spend a lot of money on, but they're very useful to have on hand. This, every time I knit, this is next to me because this is the core tools that I use when I am knitting. Now, moving on to needles. So this is something I stressed about a lot when I first started knitting. After I got over the whole like, excuse me, sir, that was loud. Yeah, it was so loud. After I knitted with chopsticks in the beginning and then decided I liked knitting, so I got real knitting needles, I kind of got overwhelmed by all the knitting needle options that were out there. And the way that I ended up going about it was purchasing needles as I went about the process. But I think that actually became more stressful for me because when you're knitting a neckline, you need a smaller circular knitting needle set, or knitting needle, like the cable needs to be shorter than when you're knitting this part of the yoke, then when you're knitting the yoke that's down here, then when you're knitting like the yoke right before you split for the sleeves, that's when you need like the longest knitting needle or knitting needle cable, and then back down to your body, and then you need a really small circumference when you're knitting your sleeves. And so there was a part of me, especially because I wasn't financially ready to commit to knitting yet, that really struggled with wanting to buy good quality, because I knew at that point that like good quality does make the knitting a little bit easier, but I also didn't want to spend a ton of money on something I wasn't sure that I was going to like continue doing. And so what I ended up doing was purchasing a lot of different needles. So I think I started with like 4mm needles, and because I didn't know magic loop, and if you don't know magic loop is just when you're able to take a really long cable and still knit a very small circumference on that really long cable. But I didn't know magic loop at the time, and so I just bought 4mm knitting needles with a small circumference, a medium circumference, a large circumference, and an extra large circumference. And that money adds up, and I did try ChiaoGoo's just because that's what everybody online and on Knitting YouTube said was really good. So I ordered ChiaoGoo's. I have a ton of ChiaoGoo circular knitting needles now. And I think what I would have done if I could go back is I would have purchased a set of interchangeable knitting needles. Now, I don't think that I would have purchased a ChiaoGoo set of interchangeable knitting needles Those run about $180 to $200, and I wasn't ready for that. But I wish I would have just purchased a cheap set for like $30 and just had that instead of trying to get all of these other needles. Because what I would have learned is that I really do like knitting. I like having that interchangeable set with the different lengths of cables, and it would have taken a lot of stress away of trying to guess what needle lengths that I needed or cable lengths that I needed, and trying to determine like what am I going to do when it stretches too much or it gets too tight. And if I would have had interchangeables, I could have just changed the knitting needle rather than, or like, excuse me, just change the cable but use the same knitting needles and saved myself some money. I am now at a point where I am starting to think about, I would like to buy a set of ChiaoGoo interchangeable knitting needles, specifically ChiaoGoo, because that's the needles that I have been working with for over a year now, and I really like them. Of all the needles that I have tried, they're my favorite, and so it makes sense for me to invest in a ChiaoGoo interchangeable set, but I'm not even there yet. I am still, like, every time I think it's time to purchase an interchangeable set, I hesitate. And that's only because I have all of these individual, like, fixed knitting needle sets that I'm just not quite ready yet. So in the next couple months, I'll probably make that investment, but I'll have to see, you know, what my fun money is going to in the future. But that's my advice. That was a lot of like telling you a little bit of a story. But I think if I could go back and do it again, I would just buy a cheap set of interchangeables and call it a day. And then saved myself a lot of stress trying to figure out different types of needles and different sizes of needles, and gone from there. The one thing that I did do that honestly wasn't that beneficial to me at the beginning of my sweater knitting, but has come in use now, is I bought both this and the red pack of ChiaoGoo shorties, and these are the interchangeable knitting needles, but they're 2 inch and 3 inches tall, and then they come with short cables. So this is, I'm using the 3 inch, I think it's a 3 inch. Yeah, 3 inch, 4 millimeter needles right now. But I wish I did invest in these, which also ran probably about $200 with them together. And I wish I would have skipped on these at the time and just got that interchangeable set of like regular length knitting needles. And then maybe spent some more time learning how to do magic loop or like things like that. These are useful. I don't regret buying these, but they're definitely not a necessity for knitting sweaters. There are many other ways to go about knitting sweaters without having to purchase anything like this. So, okay, basic notions, we went through that. Needles, we went through that. And then finally I wrote here, you don't need blocking mats. And that's all I wrote. I don't want to tell you how much time I spent researching the perfect blocking mat and how many blocking mats you need, and how do you block a blanket. And I was convinced that you had to have a squishy surface that you can pin to in order to be able to block something. Now, that is true if you're trying to stretch something to fit in the drying process, if you knitted it too tight. But overall, you really are just laying something flat and kind of shaping it while it's wet and then letting it dry in that shape. I would say that I block most of my like wool and animal fiber sweaters, most are store-bought. I block them by just laying them out on my living room floor and shaping them how I want them and then just leaving them. I don't even get my blocking mats out. In fact, I've probably used my blocking mats more as a stand for my tripod to make these videos than I have as blocking mats. I do use them. I use them for smaller projects, but for sweater knitting, you can skip purchasing blocking mats unless, actually, you know what? Skip purchasing blocking mats until you get to the blocking stage, and then you decide if you actually need the mats. And that is if you're trying to stretch something, if something's a little wonky and you want to kind of like give it a little help. Other than that, skip it. Skip it for now. If budget is a problem, skip it for now. If budget is not a problem, you do you. You buy everything. I wish I could. Okay, so that was the tools section. I talked about basic notions, needles, and then blocking mats. Now we're moving on to the technique section, and this is going to be a little more complicated to explain, which I already feel like I am more speaking to somebody who has knitted for a little while. They've done some research on sweater knitting, but maybe they don't have everything. So this is not necessarily like a teaching moment. This is more just a like, hey, I wish I would have known this. Maybe you could be useful. So I apologize for not explaining this probably as well as a beginner may need, but I still want to put it out there. And then if there's more things that you are confused about, leave a comment below and I can direct you to a YouTube video that like I probably used or have used or will use that explains things a little better than I do. I know that Taylor Earl from Wool Needles Hands has a really good video talking about the purposes of neck shaping and sweater knitting, and she actually like draws it out for you. And so that would be a really good place to start if you are confused about what I'm talking about here. But as I said, just leave a comment below if you need some more resources, and I will link you to those YouTubers who do have teaching channels and are better at teaching this whole knitting thing than I am. But the first thing I want to talk about is you do not have to shape your neckline on your first sweater. That is my overarching, like you can just knit a sweater without neckline or neck shaping at all. It can just be a sweater where the back is as high as the front and you could wear it either way. When I'm talking about neck shaping, what I'm talking about is when we wear the way our bodies are shaped for the most part is that our neck comes forward a little bit from our back. And so in order to make a sweater fit really nicely, just like this dress, you're going to have a higher neckline here and a lower neckline here. And in order to do that, we have to add extra stitches back here. And I don't know if you can see this. I hope you can. You have to add more stitches back here to bring that neckline up so that it sits nicely on your neck. But you don't have to do that. You can absolutely have a sweater with no neck shaping and it'll still look good. It just might not fit like this, but it could still be an excellent sweater, especially for your first sweater. So don't feel like you have to do short row shaping or any kind of like contiguous knitting or neckline, fanciness. You could just do cast on your collar and then just go directly into your yoke, which is like this part of the sweater, without having any neck row shaping in there. It's perfectly fine. I do prefer sweaters with short row shaping or with some kind of neckline shaping. But again, I figured that out after going through this knitting process. But first and foremost, you do not need to shape your neckline if you don't want to. The next thing is if you make a mistake and need to rip back, which you likely will. I have made so many mistakes and ripped back so many sweaters. If you do that, you can do it one stitch at a time. So I used to think that you just had to like pull your needles out, pull back, and then reinsert your needles to all 180 stitches that you have for your sweater. You don't have to do that. You can just go backwards, just like everything you just did, undo it, and it takes way more time initially to get back to where you need to restart, but you take away some of that risk of losing stitches. And losing stitches when you have like 3 or 4 rows to rip back, let me start this over. Losing stitches when you've pulled your needles out completely is a lot harder to fix than if you accidentally drop one stitch but everything else is on your needles. If you are ripping back like several rows, you're going to want to do the needle removal rip back thing, just because it'll be so time consuming. But if you made a mistake, you can rip back one stitch at a time rather than all at once. I wish I would have known that. I also wish I would have known that you can use a crochet hook to pick up stitches or fix, like if you have like a stitch, I don't know. If you have a stitch, we'll do this. If you have a stitch here that's messed up and you're here, you can drop the stitch here, work your way back, fix it, and then pick up those stitches back again. Not a great explanation, but it can be done, and there are lots of videos on YouTube that show you how to go back and pick up in one spot rather than having to rip back several inches of work. So that's number 2. Number 1, you don't have to shape your neckline. Number 2, if you make a mistake, you can do it once, you can fix it one stitch at a time, and you can fix it. Most mistakes are fixable. I have yet to come across well, that's not quite true. For the most part, I have not came across an issue that cannot be fixed. The ones that couldn't be fixed are the ones that have to deal with, like, I chose the wrong yarn. Those are hard to fix without ripping back all the way, because you need to change your yarn. And then finally, short row shaping. For techniques, I want to talk about short row shaping and a couple of things that I have since learned about short row shaping that make my life and short row shaping so much easier. So I'm going to adjust the camera so that you can see Justine a little bit better because I think having the visual will help. So bear with me for a second. I think she's in a good place. Okay, as I was saying, when you are doing neckline shaping, you're basically bringing this neckline up so that when you attach in the front, the neckline will sit more like this on your neck rather than like that on your neck. But short rows, and which is what I started knitting with, and I do like short row shaping, but they can be very complex because what you're doing, you're working in the round at first, at least in a top-down seamless raglan construction, and then when you get here, right below your ribbing, you're going to start working flat, and what you're going to do is you're going to work here, and then back, here, and then back, and then you're going to go a little farther. Like I said, Taylor Earle has a great video breaking this down where she actually like draws on a t-shirt how it's going to go. But a lot of patterns have you start in the middle here. And because you're starting in the middle of your short row shaping, when you're doing a raglan sleeve garment specifically, you are going to knit this way and do your knit increases. Then you'll purl back this direction and not do purl increases. But then you'll come back here, and now when you go this way, you're still purling. You're going to have to do purl increases at the raglan seam before coming back, and then you're just knitting. So then you'll knit back, and then when you knit this half, you have to do some kind of like, you have to do knit increases again. And this can get kind of confusing when it's the first time you've ever done any kind of short row shaping, even with this sweater where the pattern or the beginning of the round starts here. You're doing like knitting a little bit here, and then you're knitting all the way back around to over here, and then you're knitting all the way back to here, and this is the beginning of your round. In my, like, I finally have, after knitting, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, after knitting 6 sweater yokes in this style, or 5 sweater yokes in this style, I finally understand the concept of short rows. And so now I can understand why I was so confused at the beginning of my short row journey. So when I first started, again, they had you start either in the middle or on the side, but it wasn't like the beginning of the short row shaping. You started somewhere in the center of the short row shaping. I came across a pattern that, and it's the gray sweater, that she actually has you break your working yarn, which I did. This is where you start. This is the beginning of your round. That's the word I'm looking for. So you can see I have where I broke my yarn at the beginning of the round, and then this is where I picked it up again later. So I knitted my neckline, I folded it over, I did a purl around here, and then I broke my yarn. Then what the pattern has you do is it has you slip stitches all the way over to, I don't remember if it's which one of these it is. I believe it's this one. So you slip stitches all the way to here. And again, this is on the inside, so when it's flipped right side out, it's the other way. But you'll slip stitches to here. When you're here, this is where you're going to start the short row shaping. So instead of starting in the center of that short row back and forth, you're starting on the edge of the short row and working all the way across and all the way back and all the way across and all the way back, instead of half, 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 and so forth. And so you start here, and so then when you knit all the way around, you're doing all of your raglan increases on the knit side, and then when you're going back, you're just purling. You don't have to do any purl increases. And then you just go a couple of stitches past where, here, past where you were. And then you can see here, this broken yarn, I did all of my short row, or did all my short rows. I worked back and forth until my short rows met here in the middle, which was the end of my neckline shaping. And so I broke my working yarn, and then I slipped stitches all the way back to the beginning of my round, and then I picked up to just knit the yoke as normal. I wish I would have known this when I started knitting, and I wish I would have known to look for patterns that do this, because doing all the same thing one direction and all the same thing the other direction back and forth is so much easier for a beginner to grasp than doing half and half differently. I wish I would have started knitting the gray sweater first, because of the way that designer, I think her name is Dorothy, but I'm not for sure, I'll put it on the screen, because of the way that designer tells you how to do short rows. I was a little apprehensive at first about breaking my yarn, but it was 100% worth it for how easy it was to go through short rows. I used to dread them. Now I actually kind of enjoy going through short row shaping because I use this technique rather than the back and forth generally. I'm just started knitting a sweater for a 3-year-old that I did follow the old style, or the original style that I learned, not the old style, where the beginning of the round is in the middle of that sweater. And so I had to work half one way and half the other way. And it definitely threw me off. And even then I was like, why is this so much harder for me to like think through and understand than it was when I knitted my gray sweater and when I did my cotton candy sweater and I did short rows. And that's why. It's because instead of starting in the middle for this sweater and my gray sweater, I started at the edge of the short row shaping instead of the middle. So that's the first tip that I wish I would have known. Now, the problem is they don't actually tell you that on like the pattern information in Ravelry. They don't say like, hey, this pattern has short rows and you start the short rows at the end, or you start the short rows in the middle, or you start the short rows at 3/4 of the way. It doesn't tell you that. So there's not really like, I can't tell you to go look for that. But I wish I would have known that there was another way to go about doing short rows so that I could then, when I do have patterns in front of me, I can follow those patterns. So if you are looking to start knitting a sweater and if this makes any sense to you and you want to try knitting short rows, but you want to do it one whole way the same, then one whole way back the same, the only pattern that I know of as of right now that does this technique this way is the gray sweater. And so I recommend that. And while I wouldn't say for your first sweater you should necessarily change the short rows in another sweater to this, at least read through this, because it may help you understand what you're doing when you're doing it from the middle, or in this case from one of the like the side raglan seams. But that is my like, now that I know that this is a way that you can do short row shaping, I get frustrated every time I have to do it differently, because I think this is just an easier way to go about doing it, where you just break your yarn, you move over to the start line, and then you work back and forth, break your yarn, move back to the beginning, and call it a day. That's what I wish I would have known. The second thing I wish I would have known, which a lot of patterns don't include, but I really think they should, this is another thing that I learned from knitting the gray sweater, is that you should just put a stitch marker after you do your wrap and turn. So when you are knitting short rows, you are going to do something called a wrap and turn. And basically what this is, I wish I had a project that was at this point and I would just show you. But basically what you're going to do is when you get to, that one I kind of woven in, when you get to a point here, like let's say this is where you get to, and you're ready to turn around and go back, right? You've knitted this way, now you're ready to turn around and go back. You are going to pull a stitch up and over, and so it's going to look like there's 2 stitches instead of just one when you come back to that spot. But as a new knitter, I'm not really good at I wasn't very good at recognizing those double stitches, and so I would, instead of knitting them together like you're supposed to, I would knit them individually as 2 separate stitches, and then I would accidentally have an increase where I was just supposed to have a wrap and turn. And so what I recommend doing, and what the gray sweater pattern recommends you do, is you just place a stitch marker after you do your wrap and turn. So like what I would do is I would turn my work around, I would place a stitch marker, then I would slip my stitch, pull it up and over, and then go about my day. And then when I came back around, I knew that the stitch that was right before that pink stitch marker is one that I need to knit the two legs, as they call them, together instead of knitting them as two separate stitches. And even though I'm very comfortable with short rows now, I still do that. I still put a stitch where my last wrap and turn was, so I know where I need to knit together. And then if it says on the pattern, knit 2 or knit 4 stitches past your last turn, you know exactly where that's at because you marked it. So you don't have to worry about like, was that my turn? Where was my turn at? Just mark it with a stitch marker. Those are the 3, technically 4 techniques that I wish I would have known when I started knitting sweaters. I'm gonna sit back down because I've been standing all day. I taught today. I'm gonna sit back down and then we're gonna talk about a few honorable mentions. All right, remember my honorable mentions are the things that I wouldn't actually change if I knew them at the time, but I think they may be beneficial if you're knitting your first sweater. And one of them is to use the yarn recommended by the pattern. I have never done this. I almost did it. I almost did it with my cotton candy sweater until I couldn't figure out how to do the color work. But I have never knitted a pattern with the yarn recommended. And I probably wouldn't even if I could go back and tell myself this because of the fear of spending the money on the yarn that's recommended by the pattern, because I can't touch it, I can't feel it. Usually it's something that you have to ship. However, I feel like I would have saved myself some stress if I would have just used the yarn that was recommended in the pattern. So that is an honorable mention because even now I don't do that. I still cause myself stress. So I know if I went back and told myself that, I still wouldn't follow that advice, which is why it's an honorable mention and not actual advice that I would follow. And then gauge swatch more. This one's just in general. I'm speaking to me, I'm potentially speaking to you. I would gauge swatch more and I would take the time to do a nice big gauge swatch. If it's a round, if you're knitting in the round, do a gauge swatch in the round, block it the way you're gonna block the final product, go through that whole process because it's gonna tell you what that fabric's gonna feel like. And if you have a big enough swatch that you can like wrap around your arm, hi buddy, what are you doing? You went up? No? Okay. If you have a big enough swatch that you can wrap around your arm, you can feel what that fabric is gonna feel like, or you can like put it up against your neck and see if you like that fabric against your neck. And I think that would have helped me a lot. However, knowing that, I still don't do a lot of good gauge swatches. In fact, the gauge swatch that I did for the t-shirt that I'm improvising was probably like that big. So not even 2 inches. So I'm not taking this advice, but it would probably benefit you if you did. Now for the cotton candy sweater that I just showed you, I did a nice big gauge swatch for that. I think mostly just because I really wanted to knit with that yarn and I didn't immediately have something in mind to knit with it. But in general, I'm not great at gauge swatching. I did not gauge swatch the little kid sweater that I am knitting, which I will show you because it's adorable, but I'll talk about this. I'm actually doing a video where I am like walking you through the process of this with me. But notice in this little kid sweater, which is also a top-down raglan, you can see that this distance here from the front of the neck down to where I've stopped knitting is like half the length of the back distance, which is really gonna put this neckline forward like so. And then you can see I have all my stitch markers where my raglan increases are. And then when I was doing my short row shaping, this was the one where the stitch marker, the beginning of round is here. And so I had to do half and half. I absolutely put stitch markers where those increases are. But those are my 2 honorable mentions. Use the yarn recommended in the pattern for the first time you're knitting a pattern or the first time you're knitting a sweater, just to save yourself some potential issues with getting the wrong yarn or the wrong drape. And then if you do that, you don't have to figure out the yardage that you need for your size or convert the yardage from what they're suggesting to the yardage of the yarn that you have purchased. If you're just purchasing the yarn that's recommended in the pattern, you can look up your size and look up the yardage you need and order that exact yardage. Because you know that the yardage of the pattern, for the most part, depending on gauge, is going to fit your size because that's what they use to knit and test knit the pattern. But it's starting to get really dark in here. So I think I should probably wrap it up. It's 7 p.m. I just got home and started filming this video. I need to like eat supper, spend some time with Theo, go feed my horse. I think eat is maybe the first thing. Eat and Theo are the first two things. My horse is not waiting on me for food. He gets a little extra love from me. But anyways, thank you for watching. I really hope that this was helpful. Again, you don't have to take my advice. I'm not telling you what to do. But if you are knitting your first sweater and it happens to be a top-down raglan with short row shaping, these are some things that I wish I would have known. I think the biggest is you really don't need that many supplies. And if you are confused about a technique, there's probably a different way to approach that technique that is more understandable for the way your brain works. Anyways, I am gonna wrap this up. I'm probably gonna edit this video tonight, maybe, or I'll just go to bed early. I don't know. But again, thank you for watching. If you do have anything that I've talked about today and you would like directed to a video that I think is really good that explains it, I will link that Taylor Earl video that explains short row shaping down below. Or I think she explains a couple different neckline shaping techniques, but she absolutely explains just like neckline shaping in general. I will put that in the description box below. And then if you want more help, just leave me a comment and I will link a video that's on YouTube that I find to be super beneficial for that. I am a teacher, but I have only been knitting for a little over a year, and this is not necessarily a teaching channel. It's more just a platform for me to tell you about my experiences as a knitter and to gush about the projects that I'm knitting. But I really hope this was helpful. And it felt good. It was a little lethargic for me to talk about the things I wish I would have known now that I've knitted several partial sweaters. But yeah, all right. I hope you have a good day. Like, subscribe if you liked it. Subscribe if you want to hang out more. Okay. Now I'm being awkward because I don't know how to end the video. Bye!